Armed conflict, nuclear weapons, UFOs, the fulfillment of prophecy. Are we going to see events this year that bring all of these themes together? A crucial part of my job as an astrologer is studying planetary cycles and trying to anticipate where they're going. One of those cycles, the 2-year Mars-Saturn cycle, which governs the more challenging episodes in human history, is reaching a crucial point in early August of this year. I'm convinced we're going to see major events in the world around that time. I think these are likely to include confrontation between Israel and Iran and some kind of dangerous incident involving nuclear technology. Astrology gives you the outline of future events, but it rarely gives you a high-definition, precise image of events coming in the future. To try to get a clearer idea of what's coming in early August, I turn to another person whose work involves peering into the past, present, and future, a remote viewer. And so in this episode, I'm joined by Josh Maitland, an engineer, musician, and remote viewer running an online school aimed at helping people develop their intuition. I tasked Josh with looking at the events of early August, and what he saw scared me. He saw nuclear weapons, he saw UFOs, and he saw some kind of calamity involving water. In this video, I'm going to lay out the crazy astrology of early August this year, what Josh saw in his remote viewing sessions of that period, and the weird ways that those things echoed each other. I'm your host, Dan Waits. This is World Astrology Report, and welcome to another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. Welcome back, friends. Please do give this video a like and register your support for this channel if you wouldn't mind. And do subscribe to this channel if you haven't already and you want to make sure to catch future episodes. My guest in this video, Josh Maitland, is an engineer and musician who also runs his own online school for remote viewing called Rockstar Intuition. If you're watching this, you probably won't need an explanation of what astrology is, but you may not have heard of remote viewing. Essentially, it's a scientific protocol for doing psychic work.
Remote viewing is a psionic practice. It's a methodology for harnessing your intuitive abilities and using those abilities to collect non-local information from a specific target.
Protocol was developed for the CIA by physicists Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff at the Stanford Research Institute in the early 70s. It was an effort to see if psychics could be used to spy on the Soviet Union. And by most accounts, it succeeded because it was used for many, many years. Famous remote viewers like Joe McMoneagle and Ingo Swann reported some pretty incredible successes.
I see remote viewing as sort of a hybrid of art and science. I like it as a psychic practice because it appeals to the logical part of my brain and the creative part of my brain at the same time. The genius of how it's been designed is that it harnesses both of those types of faculties.
Now, the protocol goes something like this.
It's a 5-stage protocol if you're going with sort of the classic military remote viewing methodology. And each stage is sort of meant to get you deeper and deeper into a flow state. Stage 1 is the ideogram. This is essentially like a psychosomatic drawing. You know, you're just using your body to flick of the wrist, like a doctor's signature, draw something down on paper. And your intention with that ideogram is to effectively download the content of your target onto the page. And then from there, you unpack that ideogram and extract data from it. You start with high-level data in stage 2, which is sensory. So you go through your 5 regular senses and say, okay, what do I see at this target? What do I smell at this target? What do I taste, etc.? And then stage 3 is where you pull from that sensory data the key elements of that. The last part of the sensory stage is getting your dimensions. So is there something tall at the site? Is there something round? Is there an abundance of energy at the site? Something like that. And then stage 3, you sort of draw that sort of initial sketch. From there, you take from that sketch the key elements and you do sort of a nesting doll process of those same procedures over and over again. Except the second time around, you do what's called a matrix analysis, where you start again with your sensory data, you summarize what you've done already, and then you try to sense out the emotions at the site and what the target makes you feel as the viewer. From there, you start to get tangible things and intangible things. So like ideas or concepts or actual stuff that you're like, okay, I'm certain there's a car somewhere in this target. Stuff like that will kind of come up as you go through this iterative process. You essentially go through this 4-stage process for each of the kind of key elements that you detect in the target from your sort of initial pass, and then you summarize it all, and that's stage 5. At the end of that, you should have a pretty solid collection of data about the target. You might not break through and get exactly what it is, but sometimes you absolutely nail it, and those times are a lot of fun.
Now, the key point about remote viewing is that it uses a blind protocol. The remote viewer is given a target, but they're not told what the target is.
So to be blind to the target just means that when you are starting your remote viewing session, you do not know what it is that you are remote viewing. So you're usually given a number or a tag or a string of letters, whatever, that represents your target. You write down that target number, and then you do your ideogram, and with that intention to connect and run through your session.
Strictly speaking, remote viewing should be done double blind, meaning that the person that gives the tasking to the remote viewer shouldn't know what the target is either. This is what makes remote viewing data so much more compelling than most psychic information, because someone's impressions of something can easily be tainted by ideas that they already have of the target. Josh and I decided that it would be interesting to see if we could combine astrological information with remote viewing. And so I chose a target for Josh, one of the most important looking moments of 2025, one I've been a bit worried about for some time. If you really like what I do on this channel, you might want to consider becoming a member of World Astrology Report, which will mean you don't have to watch those pesky ads anymore, and it'll give you access to the full version of this video. And you'll get access to my long-form monthly live streams, including the next one. The next one will take place on May the 25th of this month at 9 AM Eastern Time. It's called the 2020's, The Big Picture. I've covered a ton of different cycles and indicators and looked at all sorts of historical periods with resonance to the current times on this channel. In the coming talk, I'm going to try and bring all those indicators together to create a synthesis and a big picture view of what we're likely looking at in the coming years. Expect to see discussion of everything from Pluto in Aquarius to the Kali Yuga, the Age of Aquarius to the Saturn-Pluto cycle, and all the periods of historical resonance to the current time, all brought under one roof. Yes, this talk will be ambitious. Signing up will also give you access to all my other live streams in which I dive deep into subjects that are a bit too sprawling for YouTube. If you want to really understand the astrology on this channel, you need to be watching those live streams. Thanks for listening, and now back to the video. We're going to need to spend some time in this episode setting things up, because I want you to understand why I chose this particular time of early August this year for Josh to remote view. We'll come back to Josh and the crazy data he got from his sessions a little later in this video. There's something extraordinary happening in the sky in early August. It's a configuration I've had my eye on for some time now. It's what's called in astrology a kite configuration. Now, the central axis of this configuration is an opposition between Mars and a conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. Oppositions signify moments of confrontation and turning points in cycles. They're times when a cycle switches from its waxing phase to its waning phase. Oppositions represent the full flowering of a cycle, when whatever was sown at the planet's conjunction is fully expressed and revealed. In the remainder of the cycle, the consequences of the opposition then unfold. Now, in early August, we'll see an opposition between Mars and Saturn, two planets that tend to signify challenging events. They're life-denying planets whose role, among others, is to limit, to sever, to oppose, to prune, and to bring things to an end. Along with creation and sustainment, destruction is an essential process of our material cosmos. Now, the Mars-Saturn cycle lasts 2 years, and unfolding stories of a challenging nature, having to do with war, disease, and contention, tend to synchronize to the rhythm of this cycle. For example, on February the 7th, 1962, there was a conjunction of Mars and Saturn in Aquarius. That day, the US government initiated a ban against all trade with Cuba. And the next day, the USSR approved a massive program of military aid to Fidel Castro's Cuban regime. So we can see that at the start of this Mars-Saturn cycle, we see a suggestion of confrontation between the US and the USSR over Cuba. So what happened when Mars and Saturn reached their opposition in October of 1962? Well, a little something called the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the US and USSR almost went to nuclear war with each other over Soviet missiles placed in Cuba. Here are Mars and Saturn on October the 16th of 1962, when US President John F. Kennedy was informed of the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. They're very close to an exact opposition. We can see how something was promised at the Mars-Saturn conjunction, and it reached its full and extremely perilous flowering at the opposition of those planets. Okay, so let's think about our kite formation again. Remember, this is the opposition of Mars and Saturn, so it's going to represent the full flowering of whatever was sown at the last conjunction of those planets, which came on April the 10th, 2024. There was a lot going on around this time, including the campus protests against the Israeli war on Gaza. On April the 16th, there was also extreme flash flooding in Dubai, after the country's heaviest rainfall in 75 years. But there are two other developments that I want to focus on here. The first is the exchange of attacks between Israel and Iran that took place that month. Israel and Iran have been in a kind of proxy war for some time, but that month the conflict escalated into direct conflict. On April the 1st, Israel launched an airstrike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria. On April the 13th, Iran responded with a large-scale direct attack on Israel, launching drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles at targets in that country, most of which were shot down. Now, the theme of nuclear weapons underlies confrontation between Israel and Iran. Israel is known to have nuclear weapons, and it's desperate to prevent Iran from acquiring those weapons too, which would nullify Israel's nuclear advantage in any confrontation between them. Iran, for its part, claims it's not trying to develop nukes, and there's no real evidence that it is right now, but it does maintain a civilian nuclear power program. On April the 19th, Israel retaliated by attacking Iran's air defenses near Isfahan. Isfahan is where Iran's nuclear program is based. So this was intended to send a message to Iran that Iran's nuclear facilities are within range of Israeli attack. And that theme of nuclear technology came up in another way around the same time of that Mars-Saturn conjunction in April 2024. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is the largest nuclear facility in Europe. It's located in southern Ukraine and it's currently held by Russian forces. On April the 7th, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that a reactor dome at the plant had been damaged by a drone attack. On April the 9th, another drone hit another building at the plant. Remember, Mars and Saturn were almost exactly conjunct at this time. Russia said the Ukrainians had attacked the plant, which the Ukrainians denied. So we have at least two themes established for this Mars-Saturn cycle: confrontation between Israel and Iran, potentially involving nuclear sites, and an attack on a nuclear power plant. We might even want to add freak weather incidents based on what happened in Dubai too, or weird events involving water. Now, on August the 16th, Mars and Saturn reached their waxing square, the 90-degree aspect, which is a time when we'd expect to see events in the world that represent a development and a recapitulation of the themes established at the planet's conjunction. And lo and behold, we did. On July the 31st, Israel carried out two high-profile assassinations. One was of a senior Hezbollah commander, Fuad Shukr, in Beirut. Hezbollah are a proxy of Iran, and an Iranian military advisor was also killed in the attack. And they also assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, political leader of Hamas, when he was in Iran's capital of Tehran. The world's eyes were then trained on Iran, waiting for their retaliation. On August the 12th, 2024, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy issued a joint statement urging Iran to refrain from retaliatory attacks against Israel. The situation felt extremely similar to the situation in April 2024, when the cycle started. So we see how a theme is established at the conjunction, then it develops at the first square. And we see exactly the same thing at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, because on August the 11th, with Mars and Saturn almost exactly square, a fire broke out at one of the plant's cooling towers. Both Russia and Ukraine accused each other of being responsible for that fire. Once again, the IAEA was forced to condemn the attack, and on August the 17th, it expressed concern that the situation at the plant was deteriorating. So to summarize, there are at least two major themes expressing themselves during this Mars-Saturn cycle. One is confrontation between Israel and Iran, potentially involving attacks on nuclear sites. Another is attacks on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the potential for serious damage there. Anyone who knows anything about the Chernobyl meltdown will, of course, know how serious that is. Now, early August of 2025, let's say the first 2 weeks of that month, is Mars-Saturn opposition time. We're likely to see these same themes come up again, and this time as the full flowering of those themes during this 2-year cycle. Bear in mind that there will certainly be other processes that are following this cycle that I haven't identified, so we have to stay open to other possibilities beyond what I've described here. A Mars-Saturn opposition can be an extremely tense and potentially explosive moment. Again, just think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there's more going on here, because the Mars-Saturn opposition is actually part of a larger configuration. Saturn is conjunct Neptune, potentially bringing in oceanic themes or illusion, deception, or confusion. But we also have Uranus and Pluto forming a grand trine with Mars. This is a powerful flowing aspect pattern. So there's some extremely potent energy of action and transformation in play here. And it's empowering both Mars and Saturn, which are at loggerheads. All this energy is getting channeled like lightning hitting a kite in a storm along this central tense axis of confrontation between Mars and Saturn. I get the sense that events at this time will have wide implications, way beyond whatever the core developments happen to be. And unfortunately, there's other evidence that we're going to see events that have to do with nuclear technology. I've been saying for some time on this channel that I think we're entering a time when nuclear technology and the threat of nuclear war is going to loom over us once again, just like it did in the Cold War. One of my reasons for saying this is my studies of the synodic cycle of Pluto and Neptune. I won't go through all of that material again here. You can watch this video if you want to know more. But I have another reason for saying this. We're reaching a massively important turning point in the nuclear age right now. The nuclear age can be said to have begun with the first ever controlled nuclear fission reaction at 3:25 p.m. on December the 2nd, 1942 in Chicago. And that gives us this birth chart for the nuclear age and for nuclear technology in general. Whenever this chart is stimulated by transit, we tend to see important events relating to nuclear technology in the world. For example, the Chernobyl disaster happened on the 6th of April, 1986. And as you can see, this was almost the exact Pluto square of the nuclear age, a key cyclical moment, especially since Pluto is in itself a signifier of power. It's about small or invisible things that hold great potency, things like nuclear reactions. Now, there are a few things to note here. The nuclear chart has the moon at 0 degrees of Libra, conjunct Neptune in the next degree. So that's a very sensitive point of this chart. And the kite chart we've been looking at in early August has the Mars-Saturn opposition almost exactly over this degree. But we can see from the chart too that all 3 of the outer planets are reaching key cyclical moments around this time. We're at the Uranus return of the nuclear age, its Neptune opposition and its Pluto opposition. That's a big, big deal. It tells me that we're reaching a turning point in our relationship with nuclear technology. That turning point is due any time in the next year or two. It may well be that that moment doesn't come in early August, but I'd say that early August is a very strong candidate given the kite formation's tight aspects with a crucial point in the nuclear chart. But there's also something else here, because kite formations themselves are associated with disasters that change the world. An astrologer named Lynn Coiner published some research in the late 1990s on kite patterns, which is available on her website, lynncoiner.com. She looked at this aspect pattern from several different angles, including how they play out in natal charts. But one of the things she also started looking at was the charts of major and minor disasters. She says that catastrophes, government changes, plane crashes, and disasters of nature tend to feature kite patterns. She also cites some examples, including the Oklahoma City bombing and the Challenger space shuttle disaster. She adds that these were often disasters that resulted in significant measures being taken to prevent the same things from happening again in the form of new policies, structures, and procedures. And of course, this is often how history works. We see major events which set other processes and changes in motion. We see events of such great importance that they force action to make sure that they never happen again. Think of how the Fukushima disaster led many countries, like Germany, for example, to swear off nuclear power, or how 9/11 reshaped national security in the US and led to the global war on terror and huge suffering and transformation in the Middle East. So the questions I've been asking myself are pretty simple. In early August of this year, can we expect some kind of disaster? One that ends up changing the world in some significant way? And will it have to do with nuclear technology? With these questions in mind, I turn to Josh, our remote viewer. Now I'm going to lay out the target that I gave to Josh. I created a document containing a description of the target and gave the document a random reference number. This is the document, and as you can see, I labeled it 3379-1120, which means absolutely nothing at all. Here's what the target description said in the document, which again, Josh didn't get to see. The viewer will perceive and record the most impactful global news event that competent mundane astrologers will interpret as being related to the Mars-Saturn opposition and outer planet kite configuration of August the 9th, 2025. The viewer will pay attention to the event itself and its wider consequences. Below this text, I also included the astrological chart for August the 9th. I then sent Josh the target number by email and let him do his thing. He carried out several remote viewing sessions and created many pages of notes on what he saw. And then we had a call in which he described his sessions and his notes, some of which you're going to see in this video. After that, I finally revealed to Josh what the target was. I know that's been a lot of preamble, but it was necessary to set this information up. Let's get to the remote viewing now. In this video, I'm going to mash together Josh's various sessions of remote viewing and pick out some highlights. I'm going to let him describe his findings, but I'll add some commentary here and there.
I wrote down my target number, the one you gave me, and I ran my initial ideogram here. So I did this all in one single, really fast motion. This part felt very strongly like a separation of something big from something small. That kind of felt like the main gestalt of this overall session, this separation between a larger structure and smaller structures.
First of all, there were a few suggestions in Josh's data of the actual astrology of this moment.
Felt kind of like I was watching a World Astrology Report video as I was doing it, which, you know, makes sense. I knew you were the tasker. But the initial impression was something kind of UFO-like, flying saucer, and this kind of overlapping sense of life, diametrically opposed concepts or ideas.
Remember, the chart I sent Josh was of the opposition of Mars and Saturn, diametrically opposed concepts or ideas.
And sort of the vibe I got was it felt like something is being moved past a point where it starts again. So I thought maybe it was about the actual astrological configuration that I assumed I was remote viewing here.
Saturn is the greater malefic and Mars is the lesser malefic. And these aren't people, but forces, impulses, archetypes, gods, or archons, depending on how you see things.
And I got this kind of feeling of brokenness, like an image of rubble, falling rocks. It felt like something was broken, did not feel good, potentially destructive or disruptive.
And interestingly, one of my pet topics on World Astrology Report was all over Josh's data too, UFOs.
I was getting this feeling of like a man-made structure, something round, something sort of curving, and then this feeling of something pointed and this contrast between something big and small. Feeling of metallic, felt like maybe something underwater, high-tech, round, and like a portal.
Josh saw UFOs appearing several times in his sessions, and he also named the figure of Chris Bledsoe, a North Carolina businessman who is a very well-known UFO experiencer and who I've talked about on the channel a few times in the past. In 2007, Bledsoe began seeing strange glowing orbs on his North Carolina property. Later, he had an encounter with a luminous feminine being that he has called the Lady. The Lady gave Bledsoe various prophecies and visions.
I was getting UFOs and higher power consciousness stuff. It didn't feel religious. It felt more like this kind of brief encounter. There was a person who felt shaken. And then I got this phrase, ghost in the machine. Perhaps like a bigger person and a smaller person. And I was getting kind of like the big person doesn't feel human. Like maybe that big person was representing like a higher consciousness or a higher power. I got this AOL, which is called an analytical overlay, which is when something pops into your head that you can name, you're supposed to set it aside. So I got this AOL of Chris Bledsoe and his orbs and things like that.
But Bledsoe has also talked about apocalyptic sounding visions that he was shown by the lady that have to do with water. I don't want to scare people unnecessarily on this very public platform, so I'm not going to get into that here. I do talk about it in the members version of this video, which you can watch on my website.
I got this kind of image of like a tsunami, someone watching it move away and someone else watching it come towards them.
Why all this water? Well, in the kite chart, we have an opposition between Mars and a conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. Both Saturn and Neptune have to do with the sea. Neptune is the direct signifier of all things oceanic and water related. But Saturn, as the planet at the boundary between the planetary spheres and the divine realm in the traditional cosmos, was associated with the border between land and sea.
Again, I wasn't sure if this underwater was a physical thing or if this was maybe something financial. Uri Geller had posted something about UFO news coming out in the next little while. He had posted a bunch of stuff about how there was this tsunami of truth coming, or a volcano of truth. And I started seeing all these kind of different things in my data and was like, I wonder if maybe that's somehow related.
And this is where stuff is going to get weird, because the nuclear theme that we've been talking about was all over Josh's data.
It started to feel, more related to nuclear energy, like this idea of, somebody holding something, pincers that is, maybe dangerous, or you need to be careful in handling. At this stage, I decided to say, okay, show me anything important I may have missed or misinterpreted about the target. And the first symbol that came up here, this kind of weird shape of a loop, it's actually really pinged me back to the logo of a band I had in high school called Radioactive Goat. So it was weird because the night before I had a dream about that band, and so I just cued myself like, how is this related? And where I landed with it was that it was kind of pointing me towards like a UFOs and nukes vibe. Revolutionary power systems or something like that might be associated with UFOs or nuclear technology.
He also got some data that potentially pointed towards Iran, which is very interesting given that I think this cycle concerns confrontation between Israel and Iran as at least one of the themes.
I ran another ideogram, and I got this kind of red-yellow color and this image that felt and looked to me like it was maybe a scythe or a blade. And the impressions that kind of came with that were maybe like the communist symbol or like a harvest moon.
Here's the flag of Iran. It features 4 half moons grouped around a sword, symbolizing 5 pillars of Islam. Before the Islamic Revolution in that country, many of its flags featured the lion and sun, another emblem of Iran, again featuring a blade. It's red and yellow, colors Josh mentions. But red and yellow could also point us towards China. Josh actually mentioned the theme of China and Taiwan multiple times. The separation of something big and something small that he talked about might speak to the division of China and Taiwan.
I got this kind of impression that maybe this was something related to a conflict, maybe about China and Taiwan, and this feeling of something from above splashing down. And I just wrote AOL splash.
Another important thing to bear in mind regarding Josh's sessions is that I also asked him to look at the consequences of the events of early August.
I felt like this maybe had something to do with decisions of the few affecting the many. So again, kind of this revolutionary vibe, a reckoning, feeling of a bombshell of truth, the color red. So this China-Taiwan thing kind of kept coming up a bit.
He got a lot of data that seems to have to do with revolution.
It felt like breaking free from an old pattern. I had this feeling of, it'll be different this time around, and that something new emerges from a chaotic situation. A new order, maybe a financial system or overhaul. And then I had this AOL of nukes and blockchain, which is a weird thing to have it, both together, but that's what came up.
Remember how I said that Lynn Coyner's research on kite formations suggested that they were associated with disasters that resulted in changes to systems?
The phrase I heard was head of the snake. I started to feel political or related to power structures again. Like the elevation of something small to the same level of something large. I started to kind of free flow here at this point and sort of felt like, maybe this is about an advancement in AI that will level the playing field for, the little guy. Maybe it's something that would allow the regular person to be able to achieve much more. And again, this may be more than one thing, and it's all just kind of coming to me at the same time. It could be a combination of ideas and technology and actual structural changes. And there may be a financial aspect to it. It felt like maybe there was a market crash or this shift to blockchain-based economy that we hear a lot about in certain corners of the internet.
Are we looking at some kind of serious incident involving nuclear tech that totally changes humanity's relationship with this technology? Are we looking at some kind of event which is then used to justify the implementation of sweeping changes to technologies and structures that govern our everyday lives? Let's try and figure out what the hell we're looking at here. What should we make of all this? Well, Josh received a lot of data that covered a lot of different domains. And I think this had to do with the fact that my tasking was to describe not only the event itself, but also its consequences. If I were to do this again, I'd probably just stick to the first part, because we might have got more focused data and it could have been easier to interpret. But based on what Josh said and my own astrological work and intuition, let's try and make some speculations about what might be coming. As I've said, I think it's possible that around this time we might see some kind of accident involving nuclear technology. This could be damage to Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which is something we saw at both the conjunction and square of this Mars-Saturn cycle. Or it could result from conflict between Israel and Iran. Could it be that one or the other attacks and damages the other's nuclear facilities? Either of these scenarios could easily lead to a huge amount of radioactive contamination. The most likely of these possibilities to my mind is that Israel, or maybe even the US, decides to attack Iran's nuclear program in Isfahan. What's most worrying about these possibilities is the potential for radioactive contamination that would affect huge swathes of the Earth. We saw this after the Chernobyl disaster, when large numbers of people had to be evacuated from that region of Ukraine, never to return. I already have reason to think we might see more mass migration this year and next. This is something I discussed in this video, in which I explained that we saw a massive migration crisis in 2015 owing to the war in Syria at the waning square between Saturn and Neptune. This points to the possibility that we'll see an even bigger migration crisis during the current conjunction of Saturn and Neptune in play through to 2027. An event that led to a large amount of radioactive contamination is exactly the kind of thing that could force migration on a massive scale. Now, Josh's remote viewing also seems to suggest another scenario, an attack of some kind involving water. Chris Bledsoe has described just such an event, which he claimed he saw in a vision shown to him by the lady. Again, I go into this in more depth in the members version of this video, available at worldastrologyreport.com. And then there are all the UFOs that Josh saw in his sessions. In fact, he saw specifically the combination of UFOs and nukes. That's a subject I've discussed before on this channel. In my New Age 2026 series, I showed how the themes of nuclear weapons and UFOs are connected, both astrologically and through years of documented evidence of incidents at nuclear sites, especially in Robert Hastings' book, UFOs and Nukes. As I explored in that series of videos, I've been expecting a confluence of themes to come up around this time: UFOs, digital technology, nuclear weapons, and a new Cold War. The kite configuration of early August is wild. It involves the three, often rather otherworldly outer planets: Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. It's certainly a candidate for a moment when we could see this confluence of themes. Perhaps there'll be some kind of major UFO sighting or reveal around this time. But it's also possible that UFOs are somehow linked to these events involving nuclear technology. And something that came to Josh's mind is the events of December last year, when we saw a massive wave of sightings of what have been labeled mystery drones. First at Air Force bases in the UK, then in all sorts of locations in the US, including nuclear sites, and especially in New Jersey. There were countless sightings of these craft, and there were videos appearing on Twitter showing them changing shape and reports that they could assume the form of orbs or that they were emerging from the sea. These craft were quite literally UFOs, because that just means unidentified flying object, and they remain unidentified. We may have witnessed some sort of operation involving actual craft controlled by a governmental or military entity. And maybe there was a bunch of misinformation and fake footage deliberately leaked onto the internet to muddy the waters and make this all about extraterrestrials. One theory that did the rounds at the time was that these drones were searching for smuggled nuclear material hence why the authorities didn't announce what they were doing to avoid creating panic. Perhaps this was a practice run to gauge people's reactions if the US military did need to launch just such a search operation in the future. Could there be a need for that kind of operation later this year? So how's this for a scenario? What if we see some kind of dangerous incident involving nuclear technology, as well as the revelatory use of aircraft with exotic propulsion systems? In this video, I explained why I think we'll soon see the revelation that major governments, including the US, have covertly developed anti-gravity and zero-point energy technology. The zero-point energy technology could provide plentiful free energy for all of humanity and very quickly improve the lot of ordinary people across the world. This scenario would bring together all the themes Josh saw in his sessions, including the UFOs, the nukes, the submarine scenario, and the improvement of the situation of the common people. And it could be the big turning point in nuclear technology I've been expecting, because zero-point energy technology would render it obsolete. Now, in the full version of the video, available at worldastrologyreport.com, we're going to expand on this information. And I'm going to go into more detail about Chris Bledsoe's vision from the lady, because it bears some weird resemblances to what Josh has described. Now, if you're intrigued by remote viewing as a practice and you want to know more about Josh's approach, then I suggest you watch this video on his YouTube channel, Rockstar Intuition. Josh also has an online course for remote viewing, also called Rockstar Intuition.
The goal for me of remote viewing is to unlock your intuition and train it in a way that it can serve you in your daily life. That's what I teach at Rockstar Intuition. I essentially use remote viewing as strength training for the soul. By learning the method and practicing it, you tend to, build your consciousness, build your intuition, and it opens you up to more synchronicities and all kinds of great stuff.
If you want to become a Rockstar remote viewer yourself, then look no further. Find a link in the description below. Viewers of World Astrology Report can get a special 20% discount on the course. Just use the code WorldAstro20. Thanks for watching, and see you again very soon.